Let me tell you what the East India Company actually was, before I tell you how it died. At its peak in the mid-1700s, the East India Company controlled roughly half of all global trade. It had its own army, not a contracted security force, not a small band of guards, but a professional military of approximately 260,000 soldiers. That was twice the size of Britain's own standing army at the time. It had its own navy, its own courts, its own prisons, its own foreign policy. It negotiated treaties with sovereign nations, declared wars, collected taxes, minted coins, and administered justice. It administered justice across a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people. It was, by every meaningful measure, a government. It just happened to be listed on a stock exchange. And here is the conventional story of how it ended. In 1857, Indian soldiers, called sepoys, in the company's army mutinied over a rumor that their rifle cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat. The rebellion spread. There was violence. The British government stepped in, nationalized the company, and dissolved it. The end. That story isn't wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that makes it useless. Because the 1857 mutiny didn't kill the East India Company. The mutiny was the final symptom of a company that had been dying from the inside for nearly 100 years. A company that had made 5 specific, identifiable corporate decisions that any business school would recognize today, that made its collapse not just likely, but inevitable. Here's the version nobody teaches you. The East India Company didn't die because Indian soldiers rebelled. It died because the company had spent a century confusing conquest with commerce. Because it had built a corporate structure where profit came from tax collection and territorial control, not from trade. Because when that structure began to show cracks, in 1770, in 1772, in 1784, in 1813, in 1833, the company used its enormous wealth and its stranglehold on Parliament to buy itself another decade, and then another, and then another. It died because at the exact moment it needed accountability, it had bought enough politicians to avoid it. It died because a company that answers only to shareholders cannot govern a population. And it died because the feedback loops that might have corrected its trajectory, a free press, political opposition, legal accountability, regulatory oversight, were all things the company had spent 2 centuries suppressing or capturing. When Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, he singled out the East India Company by name. A monopolist ruler, he wrote, could not govern with fairness. The 2 ideas were simply incompatible. He was right. It just took another 80 years for the proof to arrive. This is the corporate death timeline of the most powerful company that ever existed. 5 decisions, 2 centuries, and 1 perfectly preventable collapse. Let's walk through it. Year 1, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I signs a royal charter establishing the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. The mandate is simple. Go east, trade spices, make money. Bring it back to England. The company is given a monopoly on English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It is a trading company. It has investors, ships, captains, and ledgers. That's it. For the first 100 years, the EIC is exactly what it says it is. It fights the Dutch for spice routes. It gets kicked out of the East Indies, modern Indonesia, after the Dutch execute English traders at Amboina in 1623. It pivots to India. It negotiates with Mughal emperors for trading rights. It builds fortified trading posts, called factories, at Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. It sells cotton, silk, tea, and indigo back to England. It makes money. Its shareholders are happy. This is the version of the EIC that is theoretically defensible. A company doing company things in foreign markets. Then comes 1757, and everything changes. The Battle of Plassey is one of the most consequential events in corporate history, though it's rarely taught that way. In June 1757, a relatively small EIC force under Robert Clive defeats the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, in a battle that lasted, by most accounts, only a few hours. The outcome had been engineered in advance. The Nawab's own general, Mir Jafar, had been bribed by Clive to withhold his troops at the critical moment. The aftermath was transformative. The EIC had not just won a battle, it had become, overnight, the effective ruler of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in the world. Bengal's silk and cotton industries were globally famous. Its agricultural output was vast. Its population numbered in the tens of millions, and the EIC now controlled it. Robert Clive, later known derisively as Clive of India, helped himself to an enormous personal fortune from Bengal's treasury. In later testimony to Parliament, when questioned about his conduct, Clive reportedly expressed astonishment at his own moderation, given what had been available to him. This was the man running the company's operations. His employees were no different. The phenomenon became so prevalent that a new word entered the English language: nabob, a corruption of the Indian word nawab, meaning a provincial governor. In English, it became slang for an EIC official who had returned from India obscenely rich, bought a seat in Parliament, and now used his wealth and his vote to protect the company's interests and his own. By the 1770s, there were estimated to be over 100 members of Parliament with significant financial interests in the EIC. The company wasn't just trading in India, it was buying British democracy. But before we get to the political corruption, we need to go back to 1765, because 1765 is the year the company made the single decision that condemned it, the decision that turned a trading company into a taxing company. In 1765, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, in a formal ceremony that was captured in a famous painting by Benjamin West, granted the East India Company the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was the right to collect taxes, revenue, from the land, from the population. It wasn't a trading privilege. It wasn't a commercial arrangement. It was sovereignty. The EIC had gone from selling goods to collecting tribute. And the distinction between those two things is the hinge on which this entire story turns. When you're a trading company, your interests and your customers' interests are aligned, at least to a degree. You need people to have money to buy your goods. You need markets to function. You need populations to be productive. When you're a taxing company, when your revenue comes from extracting wealth from a captive population, your incentives flip. The population is no longer your customer. It's your asset. And like any asset, the instinct is to extract maximum value from it in the shortest possible time. The EIC was now both trader and ruler. It collected taxes with one hand and sold goods with the other. It set the rules of the market it was operating in. It dispensed justice in courts it controlled over people it governed. Adam Smith, watching this happen in real time, wrote that no company structured this way could possibly govern justly. The conflict between shareholder interest and public welfare was simply irresolvable. He was about to be proven right. Catastrophically. Decision number 1. The monopoly that made accountability impossible. The first fatal decision wasn't a single moment. It was a structural condition that the company maintained across its entire history. And that condition was this: the monopoly. The EIC's Royal Charter gave it the exclusive right to trade between England and Asia. No other English company could legally operate in that space without the EIC's permission. This monopoly was the company's foundation, the thing that made it attractive to investors, the thing that justified its enormous capital requirements, the thing that let it survive losses that would have killed an unprotected competitor. But the monopoly created a problem that no amount of management talent could solve. Without competition, there was no external pressure to perform, no rival that could take your customers if you served them badly. No alternative that the people you governed could choose. You had the market, permanently, by law. Inside a protected monopoly, the natural tendency of any large organization, without the corrective pressure of competition or accountability, is toward internal politics, rent-seeking, and corruption. The EIC exhibited all three, almost from the moment it secured its first territorial foothold. Its employees in India operated in a system where official salaries were modest, but private trading, officially prohibited, frequently practiced, was extraordinarily lucrative. The company tacitly accepted this because it couldn't afford to pay competitive official salaries. The result was an organization where the official incentive structure pointed one direction, and the actual incentive structure pointed the other. Officials did what was personally profitable and dressed it up as company interest. Robert Clive himself, the hero of Plassey, had accumulated a personal fortune estimated at over £300,000 by the time he returned to England, an almost incomprehensible sum in the 1760s. He used part of it to buy parliamentary seats, not just for himself, but for other EIC men. This practice was so common and so open that the company's bloc in Parliament was a recognized political force. What does a monopoly actually do to a corporate death timeline? It delays the reckoning. It buys time. It allows bad decisions to compound without producing the immediate consequences that would, in a competitive market, force correction. The EIC had bad decisions compounding without correction for a century and a half before the final bill came due. Every time Parliament got close to meaningful reform, the company's parliamentary bloc blocked it, diluted it, or found a way to survive it. Every time accountability threatened, the monopoly gave the company enough financial insulation to outlast the political pressure. The monopoly didn't make the EIC powerful. It made the EIC uncorrectable. And that distinction is what killed it. Decision number 2, from trading to taxing. The second decision, accepting the Diwani rights in 1765, was arguably the company's point of no return. Once you start collecting taxes instead of selling goods, your corporate identity transforms. Your risk profile changes. Your relationship with the people you operate among changes. And most critically, your political relationship with your home government changes. Trading companies can be regulated. Tax-collecting sovereigns cannot, because they are, by definition, governments. And the EIC, by accepting the Diwani, had made itself a government while retaining its corporate structure, its shareholder obligations, and its profit motive. The practical consequences appeared almost immediately. Before 1765, Bengal's tax revenues had been collected by a relatively sophisticated Mughal administrative system, calibrated, imperfectly but meaningfully, against agricultural output and population welfare. Traditional rulers had maintained systems for famine relief, opening grain reserves, remitting taxes during poor harvests, providing emergency provisions. These were not charitable impulses. They were rational governance. You cannot tax dead populations. The EIC brought none of this with it. It had no experience in territorial governance. Its employees had no training in agricultural administration. Its incentives pointed toward maximum extraction, not sustainable management. And it was operating under a dual system. The company held the tax rights, while the Mughal Nawab retained nominal administrative authority. That meant accountability fell through the gap between them. The company collected taxes. The Nawab nominally governed. When things went wrong, each side pointed at the other. The results were predictable in retrospect. Tax demands were set roughly 50% higher than under the previous Mughal administration. Farmers who couldn't pay lost their land. Traditional grain reserves were depleted. Cash crop cultivation, which generated taxable revenue but didn't feed people, was prioritized. And then the rains failed. Decision number 3. The famine and the dividend. In 1769, the monsoon failed in Bengal. Then it failed again in 1770. Crops collapsed. The population, already squeezed by elevated tax demands and disrupted by a decade of increasingly extractive governance, had no buffer, no reserves, no traditional safety systems. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed approximately 10 million people, roughly 1/3 of Bengal's total population. By any measure, it was one of the worst demographic catastrophes in recorded history, and the East India Company's response was to raise its dividend. Let that sit for a moment. While 10 million people were dying in the territory the company governed, the territory whose tax revenues funded the company's operations, the EIC's board of directors passed a resolution increasing the shareholder dividend from 10% to 12.5%. The equivalent of £100 million was transferred from India to London in 1770 and 1771 alone, at the height of the famine. The company's official position was essentially that the famine was a natural disaster, a failure of rain, for which the company bore no particular responsibility. This was, even by the standards of the 18th century, Astonishing. Even Robert Clive, by then back in England and facing his own parliamentary investigation, acknowledged that what had happened in Bengal represented something unprecedented in its combination of anarchy, corruption, and human cost. He did not, however, acknowledge his own role. When parliamentary committee members questioned his conduct, he took no responsibility for the famine and expressed astonishment, genuine or performed, at the fortunes his employees had accumulated. The famine created the company's first major political crisis in Britain. London newspapers began printing accounts of mass starvation. Parliamentary pamphlets made explicit connections between the company's extraction policies and the death toll. Public opinion, which had been broadly indifferent to what the company did in India, began to shift. And a quarter of Parliament had significant investments in the EIC. The investigation that followed was therefore somewhat constrained in its conclusions. The parliamentary committees found evidence of widespread corruption, bribery, and mismanagement. They criticized the company harshly. They cleared Clive by a vote of 95 to 155 on account of his services to the nation. The company paid a fine. It was allowed to continue. This moment, this non-reckoning, is arguably the most important in the EIC's corporate death timeline. Because what happened in 1772 and 1773 was not accountability. It was accountability's understudy. The company survived the political pressure, absorbed a parliamentary loan of £1 million to stave off bankruptcy, and emerged from the crisis with its structure essentially intact and its parliamentary influence essentially undiminished. The lesson the company learned? When you're large enough and politically connected enough, even mass death doesn't end you. You buy time. You survive. You continue. That lesson is what made the 1857 collapse feel so sudden to people who weren't paying attention. The company hadn't been in sudden danger in 1857. It had been in permanent structural danger since 1770, papering over the cracks with bailouts and parliamentary influence and its own monopoly. Decision number 4. The bailout that bought Parliament. The fourth decision was the one that most directly parallels modern corporate history, and it happened in 1773. In 1772, the EIC was effectively bankrupt. The Bengal famine had devastated tax revenues. The company had issued bills of exchange, essentially promissory notes, worth far more than it could redeem. When European credit markets tightened due to a broader financial crisis that had been partly triggered by speculation in EIC stock, the company found itself unable to service its debts. It went to Parliament for a bailout. Parliament, aware that the EIC controlled territories essential to British interests, that its shareholders included powerful political figures, and that its collapse would cause significant financial disruption, agreed. The East India Company Loan Act provided the company with £1 million to remain solvent. In exchange, Parliament demanded something in return: the Regulating Act of 1773, which established the first direct government oversight of the company's Indian operations. A Governor-General of Bengal was appointed, Warren Hastings, accountable in theory to Parliament. The company's directors were required to file reports. Its political activities were nominally regulated, in theory. In practice, the company spent the next 2 decades doing what any sufficiently powerful institution does when faced with regulatory oversight. It managed the regulators. Its parliamentary bloc, the nabobs, the shareholders, the connected men of commerce, ensured that actual accountability remained nominal. Hastings himself became the subject of a famous parliamentary impeachment trial that lasted 7 years and ended in acquittal. The company's ability to absorb political attacks and emerge intact was, by this point, almost legendary. The bailout didn't reform the EIC. It gave it another lease on life while leaving the underlying structural problems, the conflict between profit and governance, the absence of accountability, the captive monopoly, entirely untouched. Parliament passed further acts in 1784, in 1813, in 1833. Each one nibbled at the monopoly, added oversight mechanisms, transferred some powers to the Crown. By 1833, the company had lost its trading monopoly entirely and was, in legal terms, purely a governing entity. Collecting taxes and administering territory without the commercial function that had originally justified its existence. It was, by that point, a government in corporate form, a bureaucracy answering to shareholders, a sovereign power without the legitimacy that sovereignty requires. And it was running one of the largest standing armies in the world. Decision number 5. The army it couldn't control. By 1857, the East India Company's army numbered approximately 300,000 soldiers. Of those, around 230,000 were Indian sepoys, around 45,000 were British. The ratio, roughly 5 Indian soldiers to every British officer, had been the operational reality of EIC military power for decades. The sepoys were paid less than their British counterparts. They were routinely treated with contempt by British officers, who regarded Indian soldiers as culturally and racially inferior. They were being asked to serve in territories and conflicts that increasingly had nothing to do with their own communities or interests. And they were watching, through the 1840s and 1850s, as the company annexed more and more Indian princely states, using a legal mechanism called the Doctrine of Lapse, which allowed the EIC to absorb any state whose ruler died without a natural male heir, eliminating the traditional ruling class that many sepoys had grown up serving. Disaffection had been building for years. There had been smaller mutinies. There had been signs. The company's senior military leadership, comfortable in its assumptions about sepoy loyalty, largely ignored them. Then came the cartridges. In early 1857, the EIC introduced a new weapon, the pattern 1853 Enfield rifle. To load it, soldiers had to bite off the end of a paper cartridge. A rumor spread. Historians still debate whether it had any basis in fact, that the cartridges were greased with a mixture of pig fat and beef tallow. For Muslim soldiers, contact with pig fat was religiously prohibited. For Hindu soldiers, beef was sacred. The rumor, whether true or false, struck at the most sensitive possible point of Indian religious identity. On May 10, 1857, sepoys in Meerut refused to use the cartridges. Their British officers had 85 of them arrested. The following day, the remaining sepoys at Meerut freed their colleagues, killed their British officers, and marched to Delhi. The rebellion spread through the Gangetic Plain, into central India, across multiple presidencies. It was the largest military uprising the British had faced on the subcontinent. The company put it down. It took 18 months and 40,000 additional British troops shipped from England. The violence on both sides was extreme, but it was suppressed. And then Parliament dissolved the East India Company. Not immediately, not overnight. The Government of India Act passed in August 1858, transferring all EIC powers and territories to the British Crown. The company continued to exist in vestigial form for another 16 years, collecting dividends that were, in a final act of perfect irony, guaranteed and paid from Indian tax revenues. Its shareholders continued to collect a 10.5% annual dividend, guaranteed for 40 years, paid from the taxes of the people the company had governed. The debt obligations continued even beyond the company's formal dissolution in 1874. The financial instruments the EIC had issued, the obligations it had accumulated, the interest payments owed to its shareholders, these were only fully extinguished by the British government during the Second World War. 70 years after the company ceased to exist, India was still, in a sense, paying for it. On June 1, 1874, Parliament formally dissolved the East India Company. The Times of London, in a notable editorial, called it the greatest commercial enterprise in the history of the human race. That may be true. What the Times omitted was that it was also among the most instructive corporate failures in that same history. A company that survived every crisis, not by solving the underlying problems, but by buying enough time and enough politicians to outlast accountability. Until it couldn't anymore. Here is what the East India Company's death timeline actually teaches. Everyone focuses on 1857, the mutiny, the cartridges, the rebellion, and treats it as the cause of the collapse. It wasn't. The mutiny was the trigger. The collapse had been engineered across the previous 90 years by 5 structural decisions. A monopoly that made accountability impossible, a transition from trading to taxing that transformed the company's incentive structure, a famine that was met with a dividend increase, a bailout that entrenched political capture rather than driving reform, and a military built at a ratio that was always one rupture away from catastrophe. The mutiny didn't kill the company. The company killed itself. The mutiny just made the cause of death undeniable. And here's the pattern that makes this relevant far outside the 18th century. Every major corporate collapse you can think of follows some version of this sequence. A monopoly or near-monopoly position that removes competitive accountability. A drift from core competency toward rent extraction. A crisis that should trigger reform, but is instead managed through political influence. A succession of bailouts or regulatory workarounds that extend the timeline without addressing the structural problem. And then a final trigger. Something that looks, in isolation, like a random event, that collapses a structure that was already fatally compromised. Enron, Lehman Brothers, Kodak, Nokia. The names change. The pattern persists. The East India Company lasted 274 years. That longevity wasn't proof of strength. It was proof of how effectively political capture and monopoly power can delay the inevitable reckoning with structural dysfunction. The real lesson isn't about colonialism. It's about what happens when an institution becomes too big, too connected, and too politically embedded to be corrected by normal market or regulatory mechanisms. The correction, when it eventually comes, is violent. Literally in this case. And the people who pay the highest price are almost never the shareholders. Now, here is something the East India Company's story makes visible that most people miss. When the Crown dissolved the company in 1858 and took direct control of India, it didn't actually change the financial structure. The railways were still being built on the guaranteed rate system. The extraction of Indian wealth was still happening. It just had a new name and a new administrative apparatus. The drain continued. Dadabhai Naoroji would spend the next 40 years counting it. But what happened to the company itself? To the shareholders, the directors, the men who had built and run this thing, is a story worth telling separately. Because the East India Company didn't just get nationalized. In its final decades, it became a template. The structure it pioneered, the chartered corporation with sovereign powers, the guaranteed return to shareholders, the public subsidy for private risk, was copied, refined, and exported to every corner of the British Empire, and nowhere more catastrophically than in Egypt. That's where we're going next.